Hey guys, we are finally back with another Hell's Kitchen chef ranking, this time for season 10, which ended up being an interesting season to say the least, where while I feel like there were some alright chefs on the season, I feel like there were also a lot of really unlikable personalities on the season, and along with that, some pretty interesting placements, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 18 chefs to talk about, and to waste more time, let's get into the video. So starting off at number 18, the chef I believe performed the worst on the season should be pretty obvious, and that is Tavon, the first boot of the season. And I feel like it was pretty clear that Tavon was going to be at the bottom here, considering that he had a pretty rough stint across the first round with him having a bad signature dish and following up with a pretty bad service that made it pretty clear that he was going to be taken out here. And on top of that, his background as an executive chef, despite his young age, just made him an even bigger target for Ramsay with his bad performance as well. That really made him a donkey for him, to where Ramsay even pokes fun of him at the finale, claiming that he had won the season, which is pretty funny there. But at the end of the day, I still think Tavon was your pretty standard first boot, someone who had a pretty bad first round, and considering that he had these high expectations with him being the executive chef, it made sense why he went out in the way that he did, to where he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have the second boot, and here we have Chris. Now, Chris is someone who you could definitely argue should be one spot higher, as his first service wasn't entirely bad, and we didn't really see him making any mistakes during that first service, but at the end of the day, I feel like there isn't really much to praise with Chris either, where he still had a pretty bad signature dish to start, and then in service 2, he ended up making a ton of mistakes on the fish station, to where you had people jumping to his station, and even have him volunteering for the block after the service, which made him an even bigger target. And at the end of the day, I feel like he did enough wrong within the second round to where I couldn't really have many higher, mixing the fact that he didn't really have anything that well going for him, even in his first service, outside of just not making any mistakes. I feel like Chris is still someone who I still think is justified being this low on the list, considering he is the second boot, to where he's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we are once again sticking with the blue team, and here we have Dawn. And Dawn's another person who is clearly one of the weaker chefs on the blue team, and someone who didn't really do that much across his actual stint, where while he does get all the way to episode 4, he also doesn't really do much to help himself across the season, where in service 1, he ends up having a pretty bad signature dish and follows it up with a pretty bad service where he ends up screwing up a dish. He gets nominated for seemingly not getting much output in, and while Ramsay does take him off the block, I feel like it was more so because Tavon was a clear target there. And then service 2, he also has a pretty bad service where he messes up in the pizza station and kind of skates on through that. Service 3, he a waiter for that service, though even then the show pokes fun at him for not getting orders in very fast, and he's eventually taken out in service 4 after having another really bad service on the meat station, just making tons of mistakes there. He gets kicked out of the kitchen and is eventually taken out due to him being the weakest link at that point. So I do feel like Dawn is someone who, well, you could say wasn't in as much blatant danger compared to other people from earlier on. I feel like he doesn't really do anything to help his case. I feel like he doesn't really bring much positive to his run. So it's for that reason that I couldn't really have many higher than number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we're finally getting to our first red team member, and here we have Briana. And Briana is another person, sort of similar to Chris, where while she does technically make it all the way to service 3, I feel like there isn't that much to really praise with her, where she does actually have a good signature dish to start, I'll give her that. And she doesn't have that bad of a service 1 where she's not really shown making any mistakes there. But then she does have a bad service 2 where she's shown making a mistake on the starter station. And then we get to service 3 where I don't think her service is the worst in the world. However, sort of having a Chris, she also volunteers to the block and ends up being taken out because of that. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Briana is someone who you could definitely debate being one spot higher, especially compared to the next person we'll be talking about. But at the end of the day, she's still the first taken out of her team. She also volunteered for the block, and even beyond that, I mean, I don't think she's the greatest chef in the world either. So it's for that reason that she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we are finally breaking away from the boot order to someone who made it a little bit deep into the game, but had a very rough run. And here we have Rashny. And Rashny is someone who I actually thought was going to be below Briana when I initially put this list together, as I feel like Rashny has more blowups compared to Briana, but I feel like she makes it far enough past Briana to where I feel like it was enough to have her above her, but still, I feel like her run is pretty bad considering her placement, where while she does have a good signature dish to start, she has a pretty bad service 1 where she just makes tons of mistakes on the fish station to where she eventually gets kicked out of that service. In service 2, she ends up getting nominated despite her service not even being that bad. And while it was due to her being a pawn to target Barbie, you also have her telling Ramsey that she doesn't even know why she was put up, which I did find slightly amusing there. Service 3, she actually has a bad service and is nominated by Ramsey for that, so is able to scrape by through that. Service 4 also has a pretty bad service on the meat station where she ends up getting kicked out of that service, gets nominated again to where Ramsey decides to swap her over to the blue team. Though I think it's after she comes over to the blue team that she actually does okay for the next few services, where I feel like service 5 and the service in episode 7, she actually does pretty well in those services. And that's actually a major reason why I did decide to have her above Briana, is the fact that she at least had those few okay services on the blue team, though she eventually falls apart in service 8, where she does very poorly on the meat station, gets kicked out of that service, and she's eventually eliminated by Ramsey himself, which I feel like is a pretty bad sign there. So I feel like it's a pretty rough ride for Rashny, where she ends up getting nominated over and over again. And while it's not always due to her performance, I feel like she has plenty of bad services to where I feel like she'll definitely be pretty lowly placed on this list, though it's the fact that she at least gets to service 8 and has a couple of okay services that leaves her above Briana for me, to where she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're going back now in the boot order a bit, and here we have Danielle. And Danielle is someone who I think had a couple of okay services along the way, though is eventually taken out due to her declining performance, where while she does have a bad signature dish to start, I feel like she actually does okay in the first couple services where, yeah, she does tell Tiffany to cook 6 bassa ones during service 2, and her teams are kicked out of each of those 3 services, though we don't really see her making that many mistakes during that stretch. And on top of that, she seems to be pretty well liked by her team, to where we see her building this alliance with Christina and Donna. Though it's around service 4 that we start to see more of her mistakes, where she has a pretty bad service 4 on the starter station, where she makes some mistakes, also gets nominated in that service, but is eventually able to survive, but has another bad service in service 5, where she ends up making tons of mistakes on the meat station, gets kicked out of that service, and at that point, she's eventually put up and taken out for good. So I do feel like Danielle is someone who kind of fits with this section of the list where, yeah, she had a couple of okay services and seemed to be liked enough by her team to avoid a lot of conflict, though at the point where she struggled, it made it hard for her to stay over some of the people that have more potential than her, but still it was enough to have her here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who is pretty similar to Danielle in a lot of ways. In fact, it's the person booted immediately after Danielle, and here we have Guy. And Guy's another person who's in a similar spot on the blue team where he ends up having a couple of okay services, but eventually drops off. Though with that said, he does have a pretty rough start where he has a bad signature dish and also tells Ramsey to not even taste his signature dish, which is not a great look there. And beyond that, in service 1, while he doesn't make many mistakes, he also has Royce accusing him of sabotaging him, which I found pretty funny there. But again, I feel like his first couple services are fine, where he ends up doing pretty well there. You also have him in service 4, doing pretty well in the challenge despite cutting his finger during that challenge, so I found that pretty noteworthy. Those around service 5 that he ends up making some mistakes there, where he ends up making several mistakes on the fish station and gets nominated for that, but is able to scrape by, but then has another bad service immediately afterwards where he ends up making some mistakes on the meat station. Though at the same time, he is taken out here despite Clemenza having a worse service than him. And I do feel like Guy gets a bit unfortunate in that regard. The fact that Clemenza seemed to be a bigger character, and through that, it made sense why Ramsey wanted to keep Clemenza around for the long haul while cutting someone like Guy who didn't really bring much to the table. So I do feel like Guy gets a bit more unlucky compared to Danielle in the spot to where he gets taken out, even though I feel like their runs are for the most part pretty similar, but it's that little tidbit that leads him a little bit higher to where he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I actually can't believe this person is this high considering how much of a donkey they seem to be on the show, though they actually do have some pros going for them. By number 11, we do have Royce. Now, obviously, Royce was a pretty major character for the first half of the season, with him trying to be the leader, despite him not really having much respect within the kitchen. And while he does have many shortcomings, I actually think his run isn't the worst in the world, where he actually has an okay signature dish to start, which I think is noteworthy there, though immediately stumbles in the first service, making plenty of mistakes there, getting kicked out of the service. He gets nominated by Ramsey and gives a pretty questionable pitch as well, though Ramsey does give him another chance. Also has a pretty bad service too, where he obviously makes more mistakes on the garnish station, gets put up again, and by that point has no respect by the blue team as a leader within the kitchen. Though he actually does turn it around a bit in Service 3, where you have Ralph coming in to give him a pep talk, and then he follows it up with a pretty strong service there, which is noteworthy there. Though then Service 4, he kind of stumbles again, getting kicked out of that service. Service 5, he also gets kicked out after making a mistake there. And then the next two services, he's kind of under the radar, doesn't make too many mistakes, but really his major storyline at that point is his rivalry with Patrick over taking charge of the Blue Kitchen. Though then he does have a pretty bad service in episode 10 where he gets kicked out of that service, gets put up again. And then he's finally taken out after episode 11 after having a pretty bad service on the meat station where he makes tons of mistakes. He is also pretty slow in getting the orders out. And again, I feel like Royce is a very mixed bag where there's probably more negatives to his game compared to positives. Though the reason I decided to leave him this high at least is I feel like he does at least have a couple of okay services. And plus he at least tries to be the leader and has mixed results in terms of his overall success. But at the end of the day, he's still not a great chef, which is why he's here at number 11. And moving on to number 10, and we have another person who also tried to be the leader of their kitchen, and here we have Patrick. And I would say Patrick is a slightly better version of Royce, even though he was actually booted around earlier than Royce, where he's another person who tries to be the leader of his kitchen and has some mixed results along the way. Now, I actually think Patrick has a much cleaner start to his game compared to Royce, where he actually has a good signature dish to start, and while his team gets kicked out the first couple of services, he actually doesn't make many mistakes along the way there, where he's mostly just like under the radar during those rounds. It's not until service 3 that we see him actually trying to step up to be the leader, to where people start to get a bit annoyed by his leadership, but he doesn't really make any mistakes there. And I would say service 5 is probably his first bad service, where we do see him making several mistakes there. He gets kicked out of that service, gets nominated even, though he's able to survive that. And afterwards, he does have his rivalry with Royce that causes a bit of conflict on his team that gets into a bit of trouble, where he's actually considered for nomination in episode 7, though is able to avoid that. Then in episode 8, he has a pretty bad service on the fish station, makes tons of mistakes, and he ends up getting nominated by Ramsay, which is a pretty bad look there. And then he's eventually taken out in episode 10 after having a pretty up and down service on the meat station, and by that point being considered the weakest link on his team. So again, it's a bit of a turbulent run where while he does okay in his first half, he really starts to become over target in the second half and has some pretty questionable services that eventually result in his boot there. Though again, I feel like when comparing him to Royce, I feel like the fact that he at least has a couple of decent services to start is a major reason why I did decide to go with him over Royce. That, and also I feel like Royce was kept around for one more round, simply because Royce was a better TV character than Patrick. Though at the end of the day, I feel like they're still roughly around the same level to where they're here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we probably have the epitome of someone who is kept around due to his TV potential, and here we have Clemenza, who is obviously a pretty noteworthy chef in this season, getting all the way to 5th place, despite him being a very inconsistent chef and someone who probably should not have gotten all the way to the final 5. Or if we look at his run, he actually does have an okay start with him having an alright signature dish and also not making many mistakes in service 1. Though by service 2, we see him making a mistake on the meat station, messing up a steak there. Service 3 is also pretty rough, where he's pretty slow on the meat station and getting out orders, also runs out of Wellingtons, which is also not particularly great. And while it does okay in service 4, I feel like from service 5 on, I feel like that's when we start to see Clemenza really falling off the rails, where in service 5, he gets kicked out of that service. Service 7, he gets nominated after a pretty bad service on the fish station, though gives a pretty strong pitch for why he should stay. Gets put up again after service 8 after making some mistakes on the starter station, though to his credit, Ramsay does take him off the block. Gets put up again after service 11 after a pretty bad service on the fish station. Episode 13, he gets put up yet again for another bad service on the fish station. And you also have Justin getting pretty annoyed at him during that service as well, which is not great. Episode 15 is kind of up and down as well, where you can make a debate for him being put up there. Episode 16 gets put up again after a pretty bad service on the fish station, and he's eventually taken out after episode 17, simply due to him being the weakest link at this point. So I feel like Clemenza is someone that I had a lot of difficulty ranking, as while he doesn't have as many terrible services as you would expect, I feel like he also doesn't have many good services either, where despite getting all the way to 5th place, I feel like there's never a point where Clemenza truly stands out and has this great service, and at the same time has plenty of services where he's either stumbling around or making tons of mistakes or getting on his team's nerves, and that results in him being nominated over and over again in the back half of the season. So it's a pretty rough game to assess, but I feel like after thinking about it, number 9 is about as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another version who made it further than what they probably should have. But number 8, we do have Robin, and Robin was kind of dreadful to watch if I'm being honest, where they were just a source of so much conflict across the season, and I feel like it really bled into their relationships and their ability to perform, and honestly, that is something to consider there. Though if we are looking at their run, I feel like Robin is okay, where she does have a decent start to the season where she has a good signature dish and doesn't really make many mistakes during service 1. Though by service 2, she's already getting into conflicts with Barbie, where she makes a mistake in the meat station and tries to blame it on Barbie, even have Barbie calling her out during the nomination ceremony, which is not a great look. She also has a bad service 4, where she makes a mistake on the guard station, gets kicked out of that service. And while she does okay for the next couple services, she eventually has a bad service 10, where she ends up making several mistakes on the grill station, gets into confrontations with Barbie and Kimmy. That results in her being nominated there. And that also results in her being swapped over to the blue team. And I feel like from the point where she joins the blue team, her performance starts to go downhill, where, while she does okay in service 11, where she does take charge during that service, she then proceeds to get nominated for the next 4 services in a row, where in the episode 13 service, she makes tons of mistakes there. She's 0 for 4 in the blind taste test, gets put up for that. Episode 14, she makes tons of mistakes in that service as well, and also gets nominated for this. Episode 15, she ends up getting into fights with Brian and Clemenza that results in her getting put up yet again, and is even the last person to be chosen for a black jacket, which is a pretty damning sign there. And then she's just the first out of the black jackets, where she ends up having a rocky service there on the starter station, ends up getting taken out at that point. So I feel like Robin is someone who, while she doesn't perform the worst in the world, where I feel like on the time she's on the red team, she actually does okay. I feel like the fact that she got into so many conflicts across the season made it very difficult for her to win the season, where I can't imagine someone like Ramsey wanting to reward someone like her with the win, considering just how little she got along with so much of her teammates, both on the red team and the blue team, and the fact that her performance drops off as well. It just made it hard for me to have her too much higher here, even though she has a couple of okay services along the way. But I feel like it's her interpersonal conflicts and her declining performance over the back half of the season that leaves her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're going back now to the earliest boo on the board, and here we have Tiffany. And I feel like Tiffany performed alright here considering her placement, where while she does have a bad signature dish to start, she ends up doing okay across the next couple of services, where I feel like the biggest thing of note comes in service 2, where she tries to undercut Barbie by putting up Barbie's dish, knowing that Barbie miscounted the scallops there. And is obviously part of the mistreatment of Barbie along the way, though at the same time has good relationships with the likes of Donna and Christina. Though it's around Service 5 that we start to see more of her flaws taking place, where she does make some mistakes in Service 5, gets kicked out of that service. You get to episode 7, where she ends up making more mistakes on the fish station and doesn't really own up to it, which is not a great look in Ramsey's eyes. She also makes some mistakes in Service 8 and is shutting out Barbie at multiple opportunities, which is also not great. Episode 10, she also has an up and down service on the starter station. So again, I do feel like Tiffany's someone who definitely starts to have more mistakes along the way, and I feel like it's her bad relationship with Barbie that I think is hindering her performance along the way as well. Though she does have a good service 11, I will give her that, where she does all right on the fish station there, though is eventually taken out after episode 13 due to her having a bad service on the Garner station. So it's sort of a weird performance where I feel like she definitely has a couple of good services along the way, but also has a couple of bad services. And even with her relationships in the house, I mean, while she does have a bad relationship with Barbie, I feel like she has a good enough relationship with the rest of her team that kind of equals it out to a degree. So I feel like Tiffany is definitely a mixed bag for me, but I feel like the fact that she was a bit more consistent than the chefs we already talked about was enough to land her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have yet another pre-Black Jacket boot, and here we have Brian, who I think is around a similar level to Tiffany, if I'm being honest, even though he actually has a rougher start compared to Tiffany, where he has a bad signature dish to start, does pretty poorly in service 2, making mistakes there. Service 3 also has a bad service. Service 4 gets nominated even for his bad performance on the fish station. though he does turn it up a bit afterwards, where he does all right in services 5 and 7, but then has another bad service 8, where he is up and down the starter station, gets put up due to Patrick, though Ramsey does take him out the block, which is at least noteworthy there. And Molly has a decent service 10, where he's one of the only chefs to actually finish that service. He ends up turning back down to episode 11, where he makes mistakes on the garner station, though is able to avoid nomination for that. Episode 13, he also has a questionable service where he ends up getting kicked out. And then his last two services are pretty bad, where in episode 14, he almost quits the game after making a mistake and talking back to Ramsey, though is able to finish that service. And then in episode 15, he's eventually taken out after having another bad service there. So he does kind of flame out at the very end of his run, and even before that had some pretty inconsistent performances. But I feel like he does have enough highs for him. Also, the fact that he is the last pre-Black Jacket boot, that leaves him a couple spots higher for me. And while he's not this great chef in the grand scheme of things, I feel like it was enough to have him here at number 6. And moving on to number 5, and we have the highest ranked pre-Black Jacket boot, and here we have Kimmy. And I'm sure some people will be a bit surprised by this, considering that Kimmy is known for her exit from the show being really bad, and aside from that, not liking her due to her treatment of Barbie. But I think if we are looking at Kimmy's performance as a whole, I actually think she is one of the better chefs of the season, and had a pretty consistent track record through her run, where while she does have a bad signature dish to start, and also makes a mistake during service 3, I feel like a lot of her run early on is pretty good, where she doesn't make that many mistakes during a lot of her services, and while her treatment of Barbie is a bad look, I feel like it doesn't translate as much to her performance in the kitchen compared to other people. But I do feel like Kimmy actually has a pretty consistent track record for the most part here, with even Ramsey complimenting her after the service in episode 7, saying that she had a good service there. And while I can knock her for some of her challenge performances and the fact that she would volunteer to sit out of challenges, with the episode 10 one being particularly egregious, where she ended up making a pretty good dish there, but not having it picked for the challenge, I feel like up until her final 2 services, she actually performs pretty consistently across the actual services. Though with that said, I do think her final 2 services are pretty bad, where in the episode 13 service, she ends up making mistakes on the meat station, and a lot of that coming down to her refusing to get help from Barbie when Barbie was offering it. So I feel like that's a pretty questionable look. But obviously we then get to her boot round, which is Southern Night, which despite her gloating about how this is her specialty and how she knows it better than anyone else, she completely bombs the service, where she just makes mistake after mistake, just completely incapable of making catfish, and that eventually results in her boot there. And while that's a really bad look, and it's become a bit of a meme in the HK community, I feel like it's not enough to ding her all the way down, especially with how consistent a lot of her services were up to that point. So I feel like at the end of the day, I still look at Kimmy as probably the best pre-Black Jacket boot, and you could definitely make the argument that she could even be a spot higher. But at the end of the day, she is still a pre-Black Jacket boot, and I feel like with her Southern Night being a particularly bad look for her there, I can't really have her any higher than number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we're now at the final 4, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, we have the 4th place finisher of the season, and here we have Barbie. And Barbie was a interesting chef to assess here, as she faced a ton of adversity across the season, with so many people just being against her right at the bat, and a lot of it feeling kind of icky, if I'm being honest. But despite this, she is able to perform somewhat well despite her team being against her. Or while she does have a bad signature dish to start, she does pretty well in service 1, where she ends up really being an anchor on the fish station after Rashny gets kicked out of that service, does pretty well there. Though then has a rough service 2, where while you have people like Tiffany throwing her under the bus, she also makes some mistakes there and doesn't have the greatest communication in the world. That causes her to instantly be targeted, where she is put up in that service, though is able to defend herself pretty well there. Service 3, she ends up having another pretty rocky service where she ends up getting kicked out of the kitchen and gets nominated for that, though is able to survive there. Service 5 is also pretty rough, where she once again makes mistakes on the fish station, gets put up yet again, though at least this time Ramsey takes her out the block, which is pretty good. And then after that, I feel like she does pretty well for the next few services, where I don't think she makes any mistakes there, and I feel like services 10 and 11 are particularly strong for her, where she ends up jumping into Tiffany's station during episode 10, and then episode 11, she is noted for doing well on the meat station. And even episode 13, she does pretty well in that service, where while she's nominated, all that comes down to her simply being disliked, and this cast being what it is. So I actually think Barbie performs pretty consistently during the middle stretch of the season and is a pretty clear anchor for her team at that point. Though I do think she still has some rocky services, like she does make a mistake during the episode 14 service. She also makes some mistakes during the episode 17 service at the final five and gets nominated for that. And then she's eventually taken out the final four simply due to her being the weakest link at that point. But I still think, considering the amount of adversity that Barbie faced across the season, I feel like she handles it for the most part pretty well. And despite her being nominated multiple times over the season, I feel like a lot of those times are due to her team simply not liking her and not really basing it based on her performance in the kitchen. So I feel like for those reasons, I do have to give Barbie a lot of respect here. Though at the same time, I feel like the top three are a bit more consistent chefs across the season, which is why she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the third place finisher, and here we have Dana. And Dana is your pretty standard final boot here, where I feel like for the most part she was a pretty competent chef across the season, rarely having a bad service along the way. Where, like I said, I feel like she has a good signature dish to start, and moving forward, while she definitely has plenty of those services where her team gets kicked out, she rarely does make a mistake herself, and is pretty well positioned within the red team as well, to where she has pretty good bonds with the likes of Christina and Danielle that's able to allow her to be pretty productive within the kitchen. Though with that said, I don't think she ever has like a truly elite service, where I feel like she never like truly stands up as a leader within the kitchen. And she also does start to make more mistakes as the season goes along, especially on the fish station, which is pretty funny, where in episode 13 she sends out a raw lobster that gets sent back. You have her screwing up bass. In episode 15 she ends up messing up a fish in episode 16 and struggles to keep up the orders there. Also makes a mistake on the meat station, episode 17, and then at the final 4 service, she does pretty poorly on the pass, and I'm actually a little surprised that she ends up getting taken out second over Barbie. Though at the same time, I think a lot of that comes down to her having been more consistent up to that point, obviously having never been nominated. But I still feel like Dana and Barbie are around a similar level here, where while obviously Dana's never targeted in the same way that Barbie is, I feel like she never really has like a truly elite service, and I feel like with her having more mistakes as the season goes along, it's definitely hard to squeeze her into the top 2, especially when the top 2 are pretty strong in their own right, to where I did have to leave her behind here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have the final 2 of the season, and while there could be some debate here with the order, I feel like it was pretty apparent to me. By number 2, we do have Justin, the runner-up of the season. And I feel like Justin is a pretty solid runner-up to the season, someone who was a pretty competent chef and someone who I think was a capable enough leader, though eventually gets outplayed by the end of it. Early on, he has a pretty good signature dish and is able to avoid a lot of mistakes early on, and is pretty clearly the leader of the blue team, where we constantly see him like going into other people's stations to help out. Like in service 2, he jumps into Chris's station. Episode 3, he jumps into Brian's station. And while his team does get kicked out a lot of these services, it's not until episode 5 that we actually see Justin making a mistake, where he does like make a mistake with him putting up pork before it's ready, and obviously gets kicked out of that service. But beyond that, he's never in real danger of going home during a lot of this early game. But even beyond that, he does pretty well in the episode 10 service, where he's one of only a few people to actually finish that service, which is pretty noteworthy. And he also goes 4 for 4 in the blind taste test, the first chef ever to get a perfect score in that, which is pretty good. Though at the same time, he has a pretty questionable service 13, where he ends up making some mistakes there and is considered for nomination, with Robin wanting to target him, though is able to avoid the block there. And he also stumbles in the episode 15 service, where he ends up putting up Old Bass and is technically nominated, though wasn't really a consideration to go home. But then he does pretty well during the final 5 service, where he takes charge during that service and is a key role in targeting Clemenza there. Then in final 4, he does pretty well in the pass, though also makes a mistake on the line there, and he is technically selected second over Christina, which is a factor. And then we get to the final service, where he does the best he can with the team that he's gotten, though he also like has a lot of issues in that service with him running out of ribeye and having to replace it with filet, and by the end it made it pretty apparent that Christina was going to beat him. But I still feel like Justin was a pretty good chef across the season, where I feel like he played a pretty consistent game throughout. I feel like he was clearly the best chef on the blue team, and I feel like he doesn't have that many bad services, even though I still think Christina does outplay him by the end of it, to where, while I think he's a pretty solid runner-up, I do have to leave him behind here on number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef that we performed the best on the season is the winner, interior of Christina Wilson. And I feel like Christina played a pretty solid winning game for the most part, where I feel like she clearly demonstrated herself as a pretty competent chef and a pretty strong leader throughout. And again, I feel like she's a very well regarded winner. Though with that said, there are still some stumbling blocks where, while she does have a good signature dish, she obviously has a pretty bad service one in the meat station where she ends up making several mistakes on the meat station, and obviously with her team getting kicked out. I mean, it obviously could have put her in danger had her team lost that service, though, is able to scrape through that. But I feel like after that service one, she really comes into her own, where while she is on table side during service two, she ends up doing very well in service three, where she really comes into her own as a leader and really does well in that service. You have Ramsey calling her out for this. And I feel like moving forward, she continues to have pretty solid services, where I feel like her service five is pretty strong with her jumping into the meat station there. And while episode 7 is kind of wonky with her taking the blame for Tiffany's mistakes, she ends up doing very well again in the episode 8 service with her doing well in the starter station, and Ramsey once again calling her out for her strong performance. Episode 11 is another pretty solid service for her. Now, yeah, she still makes some mistakes along the way where she obviously is pretty slow to answer Ramsey during the episode 13 service. She's also pretty slow in the episode 10 service. She ends up making a mistake during the episode 15 service even. But I feel like for the most part, she's able to make very few mistakes across the season. And when she does, it's usually pretty minor ones. Though with that said, we did get to the Final 5 service where she does make a mistake during that service, though at the same time also jumps into Clemenza's station there and is pretty safe during that round. Final 4, she does pretty well in the pass test and is the first to be selected for the Final 2. And I feel like she does pretty well in the Final 2 service, where she obviously has Dana very much struggling in that service and is able to get her to perform well there, and is able to manage the likes of Kimmy, Patrick, and Robin pretty well to where she's able to pull out the win by the end of it. So I do feel like Christina is someone who I think plays a pretty solid game, where, yeah, she does have some questionable services along the way, particularly service 1. And even beyond that, does make some mistakes here and there. But I feel like she more than makes up for it with other services where she is clearly stepping up as a leader and clearly impressing Ramsey to the point where she was clearly going to run away with it by the end of it. So I feel like Christina is definitely one of the more impressive winners to me in Hell's Kitchen history. And that's a big reason why she is here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe while you head to the channel. Now I'll be back again soon with another chef ranking for Hell's Kitchen, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.